Hello and welcome. My name is Paul Kilmer and I'm the Director of Public Programs at the National Building Museum in Washington, D.C. Thank you all, the over 400 of you, for joining us for this online program. Before we get started, please note that a closed captioning service is offered by selecting that option on your dashboard below. Also, we encourage your questions, so please send them through the Q&A function also in that dashboard. To get us started, it is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Brent Glass, Interim Executive Director of the National Building Museum. I'll be back later in the program to help facilitate the Q&A. So for now, please welcome Dr. Glass.
Good evening and welcome to you all. I'm Brent Glass, Executive Director, Interim Director of the National Building Museum. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's program. The mission of the museum is to inspire curiosity and knowledge about the built environment through exhibitions and programs such as tonight's program. We are celebrating our 40th anniversary, exploring the built environment, those places where we live, work, and play through virtual programs for the past year. But we look forward to welcoming all of you back to the museum when we open our doors this spring. Thank you for joining us for the second in our Equity in the Built Environment series, which is generously sponsored by Studios Architecture. We are grateful for their support. Equity in the Built Environment is a series of conversations that focus on how buildings, landscapes, interiors, and streets can be the cause of, and more important, a cure for, social and racial disparities. This series offers new learning opportunities, new moments for professional growth and exposure, and in general, greater understanding about the power of the built environment. This series is a chance for us to see how inequity and injustice are built into our communities. We're dedicated to learning truths that many of us have not previously acknowledged or perhaps have willfully disregarded. But we are also rooted in the belief that design can play a vital role in making our world a more equitable place. In this series, the museum offers a safe and we hope a trusted place for dialogue. Our board and staff are committed to addressing the connections between social justice and the built environment. And we will sustain our vision to engage and educate each other to be advocates for a sustainable and equitable future. We encourage you, the audience, to be involved in the conversation. Please submit your questions via the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and we'll do our best to answer as many questions as possible. Now it is my pleasure to welcome our distinguished panelists in the order in which they will speak. Terry E. Brown is the former superintendent of Fort Monroe National Monument in Hampton, Virginia, and a longtime veteran of the National Park Service. He currently serves as Federal Agency Coordinator for America 250. Calvin Pearson is the founder and president of Project 1619, Inc., a nonprofit organization whose mission is to honor and remember the landing of the first enslaved Africans to be captured and brought to North America on English-occupied territory at Point Comfort, today's Fort Monroe in Virginia. Deanda Johnson is a historian with the National Park Service, serving as the Midwest Regional Manager for the National Underground Railroad Freedom Program since 2010, and she is located in Omaha, Nebraska. Enimini Ekong currently serves as Acting Project Manager for Workforce and Inclusion and Program Manager for Interpretation, Education, and Cultural Resources at the Brown v. Board Education National Historic Site in Topeka, Kansas. Thank you all for joining us this evening, and please join me in welcoming Terry Brown.
As said earlier, my name is Terry E. Brown. I'm the former superintendent of Fort Monroe National Monument. I have been on the detail to the U.S. Semi-Quincentennial Commission since March. It's better known as America 250. And if you're unaware of it, it is responsible for preparing the nation for its big birthday in 2026. So I'm honored to serve for the National Park Service, but I'm equally honored to serve this country in this fashion over the next 5 years. This slide that I have in front of you right now is pretty special to me. I actually took this picture and designed it myself. So how you like that? It's a picture of the Chesapeake, and this is possibly the general area where the enslaved Africans arrived in 1619. So it's a pretty special picture for me. A little bit about me. I am a Philadelphia Eagles fan. So if you're an Eagles fan, you get 2 thumbs up. I was born in Columbus, Georgia. I was raised in a military family. I lived in Germany and Holland most of my life. I traveled extensively. And by the time I started looking for college, my cousins who were living in the South suggested that I look for something that could give me some culture. They thought I lacked culture. So they suggested that I go to a historically Black college. And I ended up going to Grambling State University, Black and Gold. And it was one of the best decisions I ever made in my life, because up until that point, I had never seen an all Black construction crew or a Black lawyer or the doctors. I mean, Grambling was all Black. It was like somebody walked me into Wakanda for a second. And it changed my life. It was also where I met the National Park Service. I was recruited there. And I'm showing you this picture because I show this in any presentation I put forward, only because I don't assume that everyone understands what the National Park Service is and what we do. But this car is my very first car. When I got the job offer, my dad bought me this car and I loved it. My first park was Upper Delaware Scenic and Recreational Area in Pennsylvania. And this is where the Zane Grey Museum is located in the Roebling Bridge. It is absolutely beautiful. And it's such a fun memory because when I arrived there, the rangers took me under their wing and we hiked and canoed and we fished. And weeks later, I got a paycheck and I realized, I really didn't feel like I was working. I think I could do this the rest of my life. So off I went. So I did display a few pictures here that just sort of bring fun memories back to me. The one in the top right, I'm not sure how you're looking at it, but there's a picture of Barack Obama who surprised me one night when I was closing the Jefferson Memorial. And I asked him if he would hang around so I can get my staff to take some pictures with him. And he actually said, yes. How about that? The bottom right photo gives me a little bit of chills because in my early days, they asked me to do sort of like period costumes. And I was a little hesitant. I didn't really want to dress up like an enslaved person. And I struggled with that in the early stages. And then I started doing some research and realized the contributions that African Americans had made in this one community. And I started making cast stoves and plates, and a reporter actually took this picture and they sold it in the bookstore. And I think to this day they sell it. So if you want my autograph, call me up and we'll talk about it. So who would have ever thought that, a guy with a peanut head would actually turn into a superintendent of a national park? So if you're sitting at home, give yourselves a round of applause. I mean, anything is possible. The National Park Service, if you're driving down the road and you see an arrowhead like this, just know it's a special place to stop by, because in this arrowhead, it actually tells our entire story. You have a sequoia tree in the background and a bison in the forefront, and this speaks to our recreational areas that we value in the mountains and the river at the bottom there. And the arrowhead itself speaks to our archaeological and our history. So it's a very special symbol for us. In 2016, the National Park Service celebrated its 100th anniversary. And it was a really, really special moment for the agency. It gave us a chance to pause and look at what we had done over the last 100 years. And you may not be aware of this, but we now have over 400 national park units in our system. We have them in every state. They are in territories as well, like Washington, D.C., American Samoa, Guam, Puerto Rico, and the Virgin Islands. And when I use the word unit, that's an internal term, which can mean anything from a national park, a national historic site, a military park, a lake shore, a seashore, scenic rivers and trails, and even the White House. So we have done some amazing stuff, and I'm really proud of this agency. Hampton, Virginia is about 180 miles south of Washington, D.C., maybe 70 miles south of Richmond. It's a very special place. It has a lot of history there. It's one of the oldest cities in the nation. And it's not my home, but I call it home because I have never met any nicer people in my life. It's just a wonderful community to visit, and I encourage you to do that. But Fort Monroe is located about 2 miles from the city of Hampton. And when I arrived in 2016, little did I know that it would change my life. The fort is managed by 4 different entities, the Army, the Fort Monroe Authority, and the city of Hampton, and of course, the National Park Service. There's 400 years of history here. And, sometimes it's hard to get through a PowerPoint because it's so emotional. It's such an amazing sight. If you look on the far left-hand side, you can see the early Europeans are showing up here in 1607. And then we have a big anniversary, a commemoration on August 25th of 2019. If you were to visit the fort, it is absolutely beautiful. If you get to the main gate, it looks and feels like a military base. As you make your way down this corridor, on the left-hand side, you see these old military buildings that date back to the late 19th century. You get down to this area here, and you look across the Chesapeake, and you can see the Norfolk Naval Station. There's a lighthouse that dates back to 1802 and still managed by the Coast Guard. There's a 3-mile beach, and yes, I did utilize the beach. There's what they call a Paradise Ocean Club, and it's surrounded by water on all sides, the Chesapeake, Hampton Roads, and Mill Creek. A lot of significant folks came through this space. Harriet Tubman, Robert E. Lee, and just to mention Robert E. Lee, my office there was the former home of Robert E. Lee. Jefferson Davis was imprisoned here after the war. It's an amazing sight. In the middle of this base is the largest stone fort in America, and it was built by enslaved people. And it made it very hard to come to work a lot of times because of this significant history. It was hard to be in this space and realize that all this history happened here. And when I arrived, I was notified right away that we had a big anniversary to prepare for in 2019. But I never really talk about Fort Monroe unless I acknowledge my indigenous brothers and sisters. They have suffered a tremendous amount of loss. Before this was a military base, before anyone thought about it being a strategic spot on a map, they were here 10,000 years before that. The Kicquetan Indians. And my indigenous brothers have suffered a lot. If you just think about the conquests of the Taino in the island of Hispaniola, the Arawak in the Carib, in the Greater and Lesser Antilles in the 15th and 16th century, in the sheer domination and subjection of the Aztec in the late 16th century, And of course, we can't forget the Trail of Tears in the 1830s. So I do not do a presentation without acknowledging them. In 1607, when the Europeans arrived, Captain John Smith, Christopher Newport, they're building fortifications here, and they're exploring, they're interacting with the natives. But no more than 12 years after they show up, a ship glides into the shores of Old Point Comfort. Captain John Smith is quoted as saying, "This place brings me great comfort." And from that moment on, it was known as Old Point Comfort. Then at some point in history, it changed to Point Comfort. And then when they started building the military base in 1819, it was called Fort Monroe after our former president, James Monroe. In 1619, when these enslaved people arrived here, it changed the course of history. And they were absolutely beautiful people. It's amazing what they were able to do in these difficult situations. It is unbelievable. But we honored them on August 25th, 2019. The Tucker family in this photo have descendants from one or two of the enslaved that arrived in 1619, and they still live in Hampton, Virginia. It is one of the greatest photos in my collection. When President Obama made this a national monument in 2011, to me, it was one of his great achievements to preserve this story, to make sure that future generations appreciate it. It will always mean something special to me. Once he signed that document, it takes a few years for all the resources to transfer over to the National Park Service. And I'm showing you this picture here because it's really, really special. They're signing this document to transfer the resources over on the bridge where the contraband decision occurred. In May of 1861, Virginia cedes from the Union. And the very next day, 3 men who were enslaved on the Confederate side arrived at Fort Monroe, and General Butler, who had just arrived, actually allows them to stay. To make a long story short, they were given asylum, and the next day, about 10 people showed up. By that Monday, we're talking about 100, and October, tens of thousands would show up at Fort Monroe. So the same place where they were enslaved is the same place they were given their freedom. After we celebrated and commemorated this moment in history, I had to go get my DNA done. And this is what I discovered. And for me, it was a game changer. And take note of the migration at the bottom, Virginia. So I'm going to leave you with the 2-minute video because words can't do this justice. Sometimes you have to see it.
Thank you, Terry, for introducing me. I want to talk a little bit about Point Comfort. Now, Terry had talked a little bit about Point Comfort. In my presentation tonight, I'm going to give you a little bit more details about Point Comfort and the landing of the first Africans. So I'm coming to you tonight from Hampton, Virginia, the birthplace of African-American history in English North America. I represent Project 1619. We are a nonprofit organization in Hampton, Virginia, that was created to tell the true story of the first enslaved Africans brought to English North America. Yes, there were already Africans in Florida and South Carolina, but those were Spanish settlements. The first permanent English settlement was Jamestown in 1607. We have been telling the story for many years. In 2019, the New York Times produced a magazine entitled The 1619 Project. We are not associated with the New York Times. This project is so special to me because I was born and raised here in Hampton, Virginia. I live only 5 miles away from where that first ship arrived in 1619. So we asked the question, why is 1619 so important to us? We look at 1619 because it ushered in an era that would forever change the culture and fabric of a fragile society. It would usher in a system of racial divide based on a perception of inferiority based solely on skin color. The enslaved Africans brought to Virginia saved the colony and built an agricultural and an industrial economy on the backs of free slave labor. 1619 represents the beginning of African history in English North America. When we look back to Africa, where did the Africans come from? They primarily came from the Angola. We also need to recognize that Angola is a Portuguese name and was ruled by Portugal until 1975. The Africans that were brought to Virginia came from the Ndongo region. So when we look at the Africans, who were the Africans? The Africans were proud people. They were skilled in farming, raising cattle, goats, and chickens. They were blacksmiths, basket weavers, carpenters, hunters, They wove textiles, they were musicians, they wrote proverbs. Remember, their ancestors built the stone towers and temples in Zimbabwe and were educated in Mali at Timbuktu. They had the perfect skill set to save the Virginia colony. This is another slide of some of the things that that the Africans brought to the New World or to English North America. When we look at the voyage through the Middle Passage, the enslaved Africans left Angola, headed to Veracruz, Mexico, but were attacked in the Gulf of Mexico by 2 English pirate ships. The pirates thought that this slave ship was loaded with gold and silver. They took 60 of the healthiest Africans and sailed to Virginia. Now we look at where is Port Comfort, Hampton located. When we look along the east coast of Virginia, we see you have Norfolk, present-day Norfolk and present-day Newport News, but in the middle of that, you have Hampton. When the White Line came out of the Atlantic Ocean into the Chesapeake Bay, they pulled into a little island that was called Point Comfort. Point Comfort was given to them by the English settlers in 1607. So when you pull into the Chesapeake Bay, you see a small island. This is where the English settlers called Point Comfort. This was the landing site of the first Africans in 1619. You also see the community over to your right, Kecoughtan Village, which is currently present-day Hampton. When we look at Point Comfort was an Indian fishing village for thousands of years before they were run off by the settlers. A famous picture of the landing of the first Africans at Point Comfort. We show that they arrived on August 25th, 1619. When we talk about places that cause social and racial disparities, Point Comfort is ground zero. This is where it all started. This is the birthplace of African history in English North America. This is the birthplace of human bondage and suffering that would eventually usher in the institution of legalized slavery. Just imagine, almost 402 years ago, when the first enslaved Africans first walked on these shores. This is our sacred land. This would be the beginning of the tragedy and triumph of Africans being brought to English North America. When we look at the sign that's located at Fort Monroe today, this symbolizes and earmarks or marks the location of the first enslaved Africans where they landed at in 1619. We keep telling people that this was the beginning of suffrage, discrimination, and family separation that began in 1619. When we talk about the Africans, we also need to talk about the settlers. Who were the English sending to Virginia to establish a colony? And we look at them as the undesirables that England was sending to Virginia. Sent people from the prisons, poorhouses, alleys, drunks, brothels, street beggars, taverns in London and Bristol. They had no skills to build a new continent or build a new country or build a new settlement. But then in 1619, a ship arrived with cargo of Africans who would save and build the colony. I tell people that when you look at Africa, they have all of these places like Goree Island, where Africans were led through a door and put on a slave ship, and they called it the door of no return. When I look at Point Comfort here in Virginia, I tell people that Point Comfort, when they arrived there, they entered into a new door of no return. life was hard, but they endured, hoping one day they would be free. When we look at the legal status of Africans in the Virginia colony, a lot of people want to refer to them as slaves. And we tell people that they were not slaves. When you look at the first Africans, they were considered to be servants because slavery was not legalized in Virginia until 1661. It was legal in Massachusetts and Connecticut. Most of the first 32 Africans who arrived in 1619 gained their freedom. By 1650, serving 15 to 30 years. Once they were free, they were also able to marry white women, white men, and Native Americans. They could also grow their crops on their off time to raise money that they used to purchase their freedom and the freedom of their families. Once free, they could purchase land, they could own indentured servants, but all of this ended in 1661. Again, life was tough in the Virginia colony. Can you imagine 246 years of bondage before the Emancipation Proclamation? Not too far from Point Comfort, a baby was born in 1623. His name was William Tucker. He became the first documented African child born and baptized in English North America. Today, many Tucker descendants cherish and honor the Tucker descendants at the Tucker 1619 Cemetery. In 2019, we commemorated the 400th anniversary of the arrival of the first Africans in the city of Hampton and on English-occupied territory. Fort Monroe and countries throughout the world commemorate the 400th anniversary of enslaved Africans brought to these shores. Part of our ceremony was a cleansing away program. This was a program where we cleansed away all anger and fear of past racial disparities. It was a ceremony to cleanse away their souls and minds of hatred and welcome in forgiveness. Point Comfort is a place of pilgrimage. We invite you to come to Fort Monroe and walk on the land of your ancestors and feel their spirit come alive. During African Landing Day, we also ring the bell of hope. We ring a bell hoping for healing and reconciliation. Flower petals thrown into the sacred waters represent the millions of lives lost during the uncivil war in Africa and the lives perished during the transatlantic slave trade. The new dawn is rising, and I hope that our dream is still alive and that the more perfect union includes us. In closing, I like to quote Mahatma Gandhi, "No one chains a slave without chaining himself." Thank you for allowing me to present this tonight.
Good evening. I would like to thank the National Building Museum for hosting this panel and all of you in the audience for attending. Okay, as was said, I work with the National Park Service National Underground Railroad Network to Freedom program. I hope some of you have heard of the program. Established in 1998, the program sets and promotes quality standards in its coordination of education, preservation, and commemoration efforts related to the history of the Underground Railroad, which it defines as resistance to enslavement through escape and flight. The Underground Railroad was in operation from the earliest times people were enslaved until the passage of the 13th Amendment in 1865, abolishing slavery. The movement includes the people who escaped, which we refer to as freedom seekers, and those who assisted them in their efforts. It is considered the nation's first civil rights movement. Here on the screen, you see the Network to Freedom, and that's one of the parts of our program. We include a network of listings with verifiable associations to the Underground Railroad, referred to as the Network to Freedom or the network. Currently, there are over 600 listings, 665 to be exact, that are located in 39 states, Washington, D.C., and the U.S. Virgin Islands. These listings include not only sites, the places that are associated with Underground Railroad activity, which is what I will be focusing on this evening, but programs which interpret and educate about the history of the Underground Railroad, and facilities which contain documentary resources that can further understanding of this anti-slavery struggle. Since this panel is being hosted by the National Building Museum, I thought I would use the built environment of the Underground Railroad as a lens to examine inclusive interpretation. So when we talk about inclusive interpretation and the Underground Railroad and the built environment, what are we talking about? I thought to enter into this discussion, I thought we would begin what I'm not talking about. Here you see a photo from a story that appeared on CNN in 2014. The headline asked the question, "Secret Room, part of the Underground Railroad?" The story goes on to talk about how the discovery of a mystery room in connection with the demolition of a house in Middletown, Pennsylvania. The room is reported to have been a speakeasy or a subterranean refuge for people escaping slavery, but offers no real evidence to suggest it was the latter. And this is what happens. Sometimes in discussing the Underground Railroad, there's a tendency to get caught up in the architectural details of a place, focusing on the hiding places, the trap doors, the tunnels, the secret rooms, etc. One of the biggest persistent myths is that a hiding place is proof of the Underground Railroad. Popular culture tends to reinforce this idea. If you guys are into comic books, even Batman's cave over which Wayne Manor was built was supposedly once a stop on the Underground Railroad. But it's important to point out that when we're looking at the historical record, many of the references to these hiding places, especially tunnels, do not appear until the 20th century. Now, this is not to say that hiding spaces were never used to conceal individuals escaping enslavement. And case in point is a story about a freedom seeker named Jacob D. Green, who attempted to escape twice before successfully doing so on his third escape attempt in 1848. He recalled in the narrative that he published in 1864 that while evading capture in Cincinnati, Ohio, that he hid in the cellar of a home, unbeknownst to the owner. An African-American woman who worked as a servant in that household found him and provided him with food and secured him help from local Underground Railroad operatives. As Green narrative shows, the use of these spaces for hiding freedom seekers was usually not their primary use function, but their secondary, meaning they were not built expressly for the purpose of the Underground Railroad. One of the things that we are referring to when we're talking about the built environment in the Underground Railroad is the safe house, sometimes known as a station. Pictured here is the Boston home of Lewis and Harriet Hayden. The Haydens were an African-American couple who escaped from slavery in Kentucky in 1844. When Lewis was asked by the Underground Railroad operative who assisted him, "Why do you want your freedom?" he simply replied, "Because I am a man." The Haydens, after obtaining their freedom, went on to become Underground Railroad operatives. Their home served as an important stop on the Underground Railroad known as the Temple of Refuge. The Haydens' home and the Beacon Hill neighborhood where it is located is important in telling a more inclusive story, countering traditional narratives which constructed the Underground Railroad in terms of white benevolence and people of African descent as passive recipients of the movement rather than active participants. And it is important to note that free Blacks in the North and South played an important role in the Underground Railroad. As historian Keith Griffith argues, quote, "African Americans were central to the development and operation of the Underground Railroad," end quote. Even the reminiscences of white operatives speak to the fact that those escaping slavery often first sought out members of their own race for assistance. Free Blacks, like the Haydens, realized that as long as the majority of people of African descent were held in bondage, their own freedom was precarious. And as such, they actively worked to dismantle the institution, assisting others in securing their freedom and welcoming them into their communities. Unfortunately, because historic preservation has both racial and social economic dimensions, much of the built environment associated with Black activism on the Underground Railroad no longer exists. In urban areas, historically Black neighborhoods have been raised in revitalization and transportation projects. In rural areas, outmigration often led to the decline of these communities and ultimately resulted in their disappearance. Such was the fate of New Philadelphia pictured here, which is now an important archaeological site. Established in 1836, New Philadelphia, located in west central Illinois, was an integrated town, but is often referred to as an all-Black town. Founded by the formerly enslaved Frank McWhorter, or Free Frank as he was known, is believed to be the first town legally platted and registered by a person of African descent. The town served as a stop along the Underground Railroad, due in part to its rural and remote location near major transportation routes and its proximity to the slave state of Missouri. The town went in economic decline after the Civil War, and most of its residents moved away. Churches were also an important part of the built environment of the movement, irrespective of whether or not they were used to actually shelter freedom seekers. Churches were central to the Underground Railroad. They were centers of Underground Railroad activity. Dr. Cheryl LaRoche refers to the African Methodist Church, Episcopal Church, sometimes referred to as the AME Church, as the leading facilitator in the movement. Pictured here is Quinn Chapel AME, which was originally called the Brooklyn AME Church. Located in St. Clair County, Illinois, an early church historian wrote, quote, "Many of the ministers of this church were active in the anti-slavery movement and the Underground Railroad, and much of the actual work of receiving and transporting escaped slaves was done by them." The church was founded in 1839 by Underground Railroad operatives Mother Priscilla Baltimore and Bishop William Quinn, whom the church is currently named after and who you see here on this slide. Both Baltimore and Quinn were also involved in the organization of other AME churches, all of which have documented connections to the Underground Railroad. In recognizing churches, it's the congregation rather than the building that the program is more concerned with. The building pictured here was erected in 1878. However, it is located on property that was once owned by Baltimore and is believed that she utilized the surviving basement as a place to hide freedom seekers. Now, while slave houses and churches are important tools for interpreting the history of the Underground Railroad, it is important to note that the interpretation of these places often privileges those who provided assistance over those who escaped, rendering the freedom seekers virtually invisible, making them secondary characters in a story rooted in their own struggles for freedom and self-determination. It is important to remember that the Underground Railroad does not exist without enslaved people making that initial and often difficult decision to flee, and it was not unusual for them to do so unaided or with little assistance. One of the things that the network tries to do is center the interpretation of the Underground Railroad on the freedom seekers themselves. So how do we make their stories tangible? To do this, the program recognizes a range of different sites, including the places where freedom seekers escape from. Here you see the Peter Wentz farmstead in Montgomery County, Pennsylvania. While the home is mostly associated with serving as the headquarters for George Washington during the Revolutionary War in 1777, before this, an enslaved man named Jack escaped from the property twice. First in 1766, but he was recaptured in New Jersey and returned. However, he was not deterred. He escaped again in 1769. It is presumed his second escape was successful. As he disappears from the historical record at the farmstead, Jack's story brings important attention to the existence of slavery in the North and helps deconstruct the notion that slavery was a Southern phenomenon, an oversimplification which has done a great disservice to our understanding of how pervasive slavery and the racism that accompanied it was in the making of this country. This site also demonstrates that uncovering the Underground Railroad in the built environment is not necessarily about discovering new sites, but telling more inclusive stories at existing historic sites. Landscapes and natural features also help tell the story of freedom seekers. Here you see the Harriet Tubman Underground Railroad Historical Park. The experience at the park is not so much about the built environment, but the landscapes that Tubman would have traversed on the eastern shore of Maryland, where she conducted a large part of her Underground Railroad activism, first as a freedom seeker herself, and then as a conductor. The Network to Freedom not only looks at where freedom seekers escape from, but where they escape to. Here you see the routes of the Underground Railroad. Freedom seekers' journeys not only took them north, but south, east, and west to Spanish Florida, Indian Territory, California, Hawaii, Canada, the Caribbean, Mexico, Central America, and Europe. Some even chose not to go very far, settling in remote or marginal areas like forests and swamps. The Network to Freedom recognizes these destinations as an important part of the Underground Railroad story. Here you see the Great Dismal Swamp, located on the borders of Virginia and North Carolina. The swamp served as both a temporary and permanent stop on the Underground Railroad, with some freedom seekers choosing to settle in the area, establishing what are known as maroon settlements. Other destination sites recognized by the network include the site of Fort Monroe, now a state park in Florida, which tells the story of individuals fleeing south to military installations in Spanish Florida in search of freedom, much like the story you heard with Fort Monroe during the Civil War. We also recognize that the homes of freedom seekers and other Underground Railroad activists, even if they are the homes they lived in after the period of significance, such as the Frederick Douglass home, a National Park Service site pictured here. We also look at the burial sites of those involved in the Underground Railroad, and those are also eligible for listing. The burial site here recognizes the freedom seeker, Robert Ball Anderson, who sought his freedom in 1864 during the Civil War. Anderson, since he was enslaved in Kentucky, which was not in rebellion, was not freed by the Emancipation Proclamation. After escaping, he enlisted in the Union Army and ended up as a Buffalo soldier in the West until 1867. After his military service ended, he returned to Kentucky, but then set out for the Midwest, settling first in Iowa and then in Nebraska. He is considered the first African-American homesteader in Nebraska and its most successful. He died in 1930 after succumbing to injuries sustained in an automobile accident. And you can see here his farm, his burial site, and a picture. And I always try to include pictures of the freedom seekers because they're often nameless and faceless in many of the accounts. So I think it's important to put a face on these people who made that brave decision to escape from slavery. Recognizing that much of the built environment of the Underground Railroad has disappeared from the landscape or has been altered, another way the program acknowledges the experience of freedom seekers is through the listing of commemorative sites, like the historical marker that appears here. This marker tells the story of Caroline, a woman who escaped with her 4 children from Kentucky in 1847. She was captured, but with the help of sympathetic Black and white residents in Decatur County, Indiana, she and her children were able to escape their captor and are believed to have made it safely to Canada. I think it is important to note that inclusive Underground Railroad interpretation goes beyond just Black and white. Included in the program are sites that recognize the involvement of Native Americans in the Underground Railroad, including their enslavement. I just want to say a few things in closing. First, while place is important, it's important to remember that the Underground Railroad is really a story about people who took great personal risks to secure their own freedom or that of others. Second, to emphasize the involvement of people of color in the Underground Railroad is not to discount white participation in this activism, but to broaden our understanding of this complex and nuanced grassroots movement in which diverse groups of people worked across racial, gender, religious, and class lines in hopes of promoting social change. The Underground Railroad continues to serve as a powerful reminder that what unites us is more important than what divides us. Third, to talk about agency and resistance of those who were enslaved does not negate the brutality, oppressiveness, and inequities of these systems of domination, but is a testament to the resiliency and perseverance of the human spirit and their innate desire for freedom. And lastly, when we talk about inclusivity interpretation, and history for groups that have been marginalized in the historical record, inclusivity is not simply about being present, but about how they are present. The way in which we tell history matters. Thank you. I will now turn it over to the next presenter.
All right, good evening. I'm hoping that all can hear me. Happy Tuesday to all. As stated earlier in the program, my name is Enimini Ekong, and I serve as the program manager for interpretation, education, cultural resources at Brown versus Board of Education National Historic Site. And it's a very fancy way of saying that I facilitate a team of very passionate individuals who come to work every day to share our nation's story about how we desegregated, and to literally have a conversation about race every day. For my presentation, I might take a bit of a different angle in that the question at hand is, how is the NPS telling the whole story? And if there were ever a quintessential example, Brown versus Board of Education is just that out of the 423 national park sites throughout the system, Brown versus Board of Education is the only one dedicated to a Supreme Court case, and a very notable one at that. And so in my brief presentation, I'm gonna highlight more specifically the nuts and bolts of how we tell the comprehensive story, and then really dive into kind of the latter part of this series, which addresses the question of equity, and more importantly, whether or not these sites that we've talked about throughout this presentation are in fact a possibility for a cure when we talk about racial and social disparities. So one thing that's very unique about National Historic Sites, because as we talk about museums, there's oftentimes a conversation that happens among museums and National Park historic sites, monuments, parks, of what exactly is the demarcation, what makes a historical site so different from that of a museum. And I would venture to say, in partnership with all of our local museums, that one of the greatest demarcations between our national park sites and museums is that we are hand delivered to communities for the sake of all communities by way of Congress. That we have an enabling legislation for every national park site, monument, park, to ensure that the valued history that we've set apart is to go into in perpetuity, but it ensures that the importance and the significance and the accuracy of this story is not limited by funding, by partnership, by polity, but that we're consistently committed to the reality of whatever that story is. And when you think about the 423 sites that serve as a mosaic for our American history, it is just that. All of our National Park Service sites speak to everything that has made us fundamentally American. And what's very interesting is in this very brief presentation, we've seen just what the 2 or 3 sites that we've been able to focus on can illuminate. And as you go from park site to park site, it is supposed to help you get a better understanding, good, challenging, and indifferent, what it's taken for us to be a country, what it's taken for us to appreciate our democracy, to wrestle with our democracy, even to present day, right? In a lot of many more momentous ways. And so every park site is governed and delivered by an enabling legislation. Congress says this place is important, we'll protect it, we'll fund it, so that there's never a reason for the general public, and I say general because it's not just the American public, it's international public, that come to our sites to learn of this history and take away what they may about what has established our democracy. Specifically at Brown versus Board of Education, I want to talk about what we're doing to build a more comprehensive story. So it's not just enough for us to talk about this landmark case that really served as the catalyst for the civil rights movement. This is not a case that kind of operates in a silo. And so here in a couple of slides, I'll speak more to that. But in the top right corner, you'll see that our exhibits are geared for all audiences. You'll know the growing changes that are going in and throughout the National Park Service is that we want to ensure that all audiences feel welcome whenever we are telling our stories. And so here in the top left corner, you'll see that we've started establishing and renovating our exhibits so that they are more ADA accessible, because our goal is that whenever you walk into a National Park Service site, you're able to get the same experience, whether you're visually impaired, hearing impaired, whether you can walk or not. And part of our inclusive approach to being able to level the playing field whenever we talk about our American history is ensuring that it is accessible, literally down to the touch of your finger when you come to our sites. You'll see there's an amazing feature of the Hall of Courage for those of you who ever plan a visit to Brown versus Board of Education, which really appeals to your auditory senses. There's history that we tell that just doesn't pinpoint Brown versus Board of Education in the landmark case, but that we speak about the 4 other cases that made Brown possible. We reinvigorate the experience of an actual classroom so that part of that interpretive experience is you literally taste, touch, see. We want to appeal to all 5 senses in such a way that it's, as I've also often told my team there at Brown, it's not good enough for individuals to come through our doors and leave saying, wow, that was a really great story, because in fact, it's history. Linda Brown, who is a key centerpiece of this court case, passed away on March 25th of 2018. So here, as we come up on March, we're coming up on a 3-year anniversary. She is survived by her mother, who is well into her mid to late 90s. And so when we talk about this history, it's very, very tangible, because many of those who were most proximate to this history are still alive. Our audiences range from 0 to 99. And this is the unique beauty of the National Park Service, is that for whom we're trying to reach, there is no barrier, there is no restriction. If you are 1 year old, if you're 3 years old, if you're 7 years old, there are programs like Junior Ranger programs that we design to ensure that when you're going through our historic sites, that your experience is just as engaging as it would be for your parent or your grandparent. You'll find that we seek audiences that are college age and affinity groups who are wanting to do deep dives into history, not simply just to be able to get a course credit, but in many ways it matriculates into them becoming volunteers, and then eventually, in many cases, them desiring to become park rangers themselves. To bridge a part of the comprehensive approach whenever we're talking about interpretation, very, very few understand that while we talk about the Brown versus Board of Education landmark case, it was preceded by Mendez versus Westminster. There was a very bright young lady who was anticipating her first day of school in Orange County, California, by the name of Gloria Mendez. And she was there in California. She went to school in the early 1940s. And unbeknownst to her, long before we ever knew about the story about Linda Brown, Gloria Mendez was barred from her school. It was understood that any Mexican American or anyone who had Mexican American ancestry was not allowed to attend the local schools there in Orange County. Gloria Mendez's father and parents decided to seek out legal representation. They put together a successful legal case, and they won. And Gloria Mendez was then able to go to her school there in the Westminster School District. And the attorney that assisted them in navigating this very tumultuous time was a gentleman by the name of Thurgood Marshall. This case was won in 1947. And it was part of the legal practice and acumen of Thurgood Marshall that had him reach out to the Briggs family in 1950 out in South Carolina to figure out how they could, in a very strategic manner, put together a compelling case to the highest court in the land to strike down not just the segregation in schools, but to try their best at trying to achieve equity among Black and brown children across the nation. And so it is the connection and the holistic part of the story that we tell at Brown that had there not been a Mendez versus Westminster, there wouldn't be a Brown versus Board of Education. And in that, the story of Brown versus Board of Education is comprehensive of women and children whom we continue to tout were the backbone of the civil rights movement. That had it not been for women and children, we're not exactly sure where we would be right now, in part because it was always easier for women and children to get imprisoned rather than working fathers, because if a father went to jail, it was likely there goes the family. And so the comprehensive story of Brown versus Board of Education highlights so many more connections, not only within the Park Service, but in what we understand to be our American history. We like to think of ourselves as classrooms that aren't limited to a semester. We're not limited to a school year, but that 365 days out of the year, we provide the connections and the understandings and the holistic approach to history in a way that is oftentimes just not achievable in your traditional academic experience. And so you'll see throughout these pictures, Little Rock Central High School, the bus boycott in Selma, or rather in Montgomery, Alabama, those that crossed the Edmund Pettus Bridge, Martin Luther King, and Cesar Chavez. And each one of those sites has an indelible connection to Brown versus Board of Education, in part because they either helped propel the Brown versus Board of Education case, they played a role in being connected to how Brown versus Board of Education served as a catalyst, but that so many more of our National Park Service sites provide that clarity of understanding of how comprehensive our story can and is, can be and is. So before concluding, I want to play on this idea of national parks being able to help us see, touch, and realize equity in ways that, if not tuned in, could very well be missed. In the real estate profession, it's well understood that there is this idea of equity that has to do with your assets minus your liabilities. So if you'll indulge me very briefly, here you see both Brown versus Board of Education and you see the Frederick Douglass House. Taking the Frederick Douglass House, since it is a house, if the asset that we're talking about is the Frederick Douglass House and it costs $2, and the liabilities or the debt that we have on the house is $1, it's natural to say that this house has an equity of $1. Now, if you take that very similar concept and you bring that to the national park, let's just assume that liabilities are barriers. And so when the National Park Service gets established in 1916, it was well understood that National Park Service sites weren't accessible to all. And some would argue by design. And over the evolution of the National Park Service, there have been more assets that have been added that have in many ways lifted the barriers that have brought about more equity. That at one point, most of our National Park Service sites really focused on the natural environment and not so much our heritage and our civic discourse. Things like the Vietnam Memorial, the Lincoln Memorial, the first Women's Memorial, Stonewall. The list goes on of the number of different sites that as we've added assets, we've lifted barriers where you no longer have to be able to afford to go to a national park. In many ways, we're nestled in many communities, lifting the barriers and bridging that barrier that would oftentimes have individuals say, oh, I'll never be able to go to a national park in part because I can't afford to. Nowadays, in many cases, many of the trails that the American public walk on are in some way or another connected to a national park. Many of the stories that we tell are much more relevant, even if you're not a nature buff. And then for those of you who are nature buffs, the land that we preserve has come at great cost. And I think Terry spoke to that our Indigenous brothers and sisters have secured for us land that was sacred. And we've named it, we've done many other things with it, but the natural environment oftentimes has more stories to tell than the leaves, the trees, and the experience that we get there. And it's for that and many other reasons that we firmly believe that there are many ways that the National Park Service sites, monuments, and landscapes can serve as a part of a cure. And so with that, I think it's only fitting that we have a much larger conversation about what that looks like. And so I will hand it back to Paul.
Thank you so much. And I invite all of our panelists to please open their mics and their videos. We've got some great questions. Some are particularly focused, as this first one. Terry, I was wondering if you felt that the National Park Service supplied supportive programs or initiatives for an open space for you to express your sometimes conflicted feelings at Fort Monroe?
Well, that's a really great question. The Park Service has never stopped me from telling a story that's relevant to the site. Matter of fact, they've encouraged me to do more, if I'm being honest here. I think, when we are talking about telling these kind of stories in these spaces, it can often be very challenging because, we work in a space where people vacation. And most of the time, they don't want to hear about some African showing up on some shore. That's just not part of their vacation plan. So the question for us to the visitor is, how do we set them up to be successful so that they have an overall good experience and learn something while they're in that space? And that's an art form. And when I took over Fort Monroe, it was a brand new park. It was not a park that was established for 100 years, where all of a sudden the Park Service comes in and said, now you need to start talking about African Americans. That might be hard on the staff, and it's definitely going to be hard on the visitors. But Fort Monroe was brand new, so I was able to set the standard from the start. If you come to Fort Monroe, you will hear about enslaved people. And that's not a pretty story, but it's not said in a way for you to walk away angry. It's designed for you to learn more. If you could provoke thought, then you're winning. I know I'm going long, but
no.
You're winning.
Yeah, that's a perfect response. And our follow-up question is to you, Mr. Pearson. Folks who are asking, how do they support you and the work that you're doing?
If they're talking about financially, they can go to my website, which is project1619.org. project1619.org. We have a donation button.
Awesome. We got another question. For those of you, for those of us who are interpreting historic sites, built environments, can the panel offer some suggestions on how to best connect even the most uninterested visitors to these places? I know that's a loaded question, usually left to the visitor guides or your interpretation, but I think it applies.
Well, I think you need to find out what they are interested in and not what they're not interested in. Once you can find out what they're interested in, you can start doing presentations or programs or forums. I mean, a good way to do that is to do a forum on what they're interested in, but also have additional panelists who are going to contest them or challenge them on their position. Conversation is great to have. It opens up new doors of communication. So I'm in favor of a lot of forums.
I can say for the National Park Service, and particularly for an interpretive ranger, it is your obligation as a part of your ranger duties for you to know your resource. And whenever you're engaging a visitor, when you lead with questions, the better you know your resource, the better you can build connections. And so the idea is not necessarily to have every visitor walk away with the same information, but it is your obligation as a ranger or an interpreter to ensure that every visitor builds their own unique connection to the site that will stay with them when they leave the site. And so part of that is really tapping into the needs of that particular visitor, being able to know the resource well enough to get connections and say, oh, well, President Eisenhower, I see you have a love for presidents, and you connect the site and a passion that they have with your site, and help them walk away looking at your site very intimately, so that there's more of a visceral response to their recollection of your site, rather than they can just spout off information.
Dee or Terry, would you like to reply?
I do, but I'll let Ms. Johnson go first if you have something.
Yeah, I think one of the ways, I think sometimes when we're talking about the built environment, we get too caught up. I've been to a lot of museums that even they're Underground Railroad focused, and you spend the first 30 minutes on a furniture tour, and people really aren't interested in, some people are interested in furniture, don't get me wrong. Some people love furniture, but I think it's the human stories that really capture people's attention. Kind of those stories about people, there's like these universal things that everybody, the love of family, those things are what connect people, because they can find kind of similarities with their own lives and experience in these people's struggles. And I think that's finding that human element. The built environment is great, but the built environment is so dependent on human interaction. And I think it's important to bring out that human interaction when we're talking about the built environment.
Absolutely. Terry?
Yeah, no doubt about it. I would also say that when you're interpreting in these spaces, history is very, very complicated, and it can be a little edgy. So there's an art form to this. I used to interpret at Independence Hall, where the founding fathers signed the Declaration and the Constitution. And I used to walk into a room of 100 people and give them this beautiful story about the founding fathers and how that beautiful transfer of power took place when Washington handed it over. And then at the very end of that, I would go, but these men owned slaves.
Yes.
Now, there's a way to do that. And you develop that muscle over time, but you're going to have to get over the fear of being able to be honest in your interpretation, make sure your resources are factual, and as much as possible, leave the emotion out of it, so it doesn't appear that it's coming from a personal place. I can love George Washington, but I can also critique him too. And there's some beauty in that delivery when you actually master that.
So I've invited you all. I'm not asking you to represent the National Park Service writ large, but I just wonder if your individual stories can give us an insight, and Mr. Pearson, you can feed into this as well, in how the National Park Service is interpreting the entirety of the country's history through your individual parks that you represent. Randomly.
Yeah, it was a learning process. The history of the first enslaved Africans is a complicated story. It's one that a lot of people did not want to recognize. And I pretty much had to force that narrative on people so they could understand. I had to make people realize just how important Point Comfort was and how important Fort Monroe is. And they did not have that concept maybe only about 15 years ago. So it was a long process to teach people that you've got a gem here. The first African landing site in English North America. It's where our first ancestors arrived, and it made it more personal to me when I found out that one of those first people on that ship in 1619 is one of my direct ancestors. So there's a lot of connection. So yeah, we are so thankful for Superintendent Brown, and we hate to see him leave because he felt the passion, he felt the spirit. And that's what it takes when you run a National Park Service. You got to feel it. You just can't talk about it. You got to feel it. And that's the reputation that Superintendent Brown has. So we're in a good place right now because we have taught those people in the positions of authority to recognize what you have, promote what you have, because right now we're in the process of building a national memorial at Fort Monroe to honor the first Africans. And that wouldn't have taken place 10 years ago.
So, Mr. Pearson, there was a question from one of our audience members asking how he or she could support your efforts. And so perhaps in a separate email, you can share with me how to do that, and I can share that out with our audience.
I'd be glad to.
I'll be brief in answering your question, Paul. I've long since shared, particularly at my current site, that I have the benefit of going to work every day to talk about race. I get to relive the consequences, both intended and unintended, of what this landmark case did. As a father of a queen in training, I get to kind of put myself in the shoes of Oliver Brown and think, what would I do if my daughter was rejected rightfully for a school that she could attend? And not to mention that for those who are unfamiliar, integration was not a wholesale effort by all African Americans. There were individuals who abhorred the idea of integrating with every fiber of their being, and so that there was a challenge between not only races but internally among communities, that they didn't want to break up the status quo because of everything that segregation afforded the African American community, minus many of the equities, because Kansas was, for all intents and purposes, most equitable, which is why it was so key in the landmark case, is that we had to prove that a state that was actually achieving equity was still inequitable. And that's what was literally the straw that broke the camel's back in the Supreme Court case. But yes, for me, it is literally sharing on a daily basis a lived experience.
Dee?
So I work in the Underground Railroad program, and so like Mr. Ekong, talking about race is a kind of a daily part of my existence. But one of the things that really fascinates me about the Underground Railroad, in addition to it being still a source of inspiration for modern day social justice movements, which I think is really interesting, that people still go back and harken back to the Underground Railroad, the interracial cooperation, you know, all these things that still remain important to people today. And that's kind of where I kind of find life in this, is that, you know, things have changed over the past 200 years or so since slavery ended, but that struggle for civil rights, which began during the Underground Railroad, is still going on. Yeah. And it's just amazing to read some of these stories. Like one abolitionist woman who was involved in the Underground Railroad said, what we abolitionists have been fighting for is for the white man to take his knee off the black man's neck. And I read that and I was like, this could have been written today. And that's what really excites me, is that, you know, we made progress as a nation, but there's some things we're still grappling with. There's so many lessons from the past that we still have to learn. And I think coming to terms with that struggle and looking at civil rights, and not just for African Americans, but people of color, for women, for all those things, these are struggles that we are still dealing with. And I think the Underground Railroad provides an important kind of touchstone for us to look at where we've been and where we're going.
Yeah, gosh, I think we have like 2 minutes left. I would love to know how you all have, since we've invited you to this program, felt about the built environment and how it contributes to or enables sort of inequities in our world. Hopefully towards the, contributes to the positive end of that question. So I just throw that out as a random, for free for all for you all.
I'll go out on a limb and say that we're all very clear that we live in a meritocracy, and that there are certain opportunities that are afforded to you on the basis of merit, on the basis of your social climate, and a number of other things. And so I think, and that's more what I was trying to lean upon towards the latter part of my presentation is, one of the gifts that the National Park Service gives the globe and anybody who would taste of our national treasures is that we're trying to minimize as best as possible any barrier that would keep you from, like Deandra was saying, be able to examine the things that we've wrestled with, and in many ways are still wrestling with. I mean, I would venture to say that our marketing plan is that we would like to become irrelevant as an agency because the history that we talk about is no longer needed. But I think part of our existence is reminding us of our heritage, to build in patriotism, which I feel is a fine tension between the good, challenging, and indifferent, as opposed to the things that we can celebrate. And to that, I think Terry can even speak more to that as we prepare for the 250th, that there's a lot to celebrate that has made us a democracy that isn't necessarily worth bringing out your bullhorn. But it does push us to a place of reflection that would cause us otherwise to be a little bit more, to be governed by sobriety.
Yeah, and certainly, Mr. Pearson, you have a role in that as well, I'm assuming.
Well, I've always talked about a pilgrimage to Fort Monroe, to come back home and reconnect to your ancestors. I'm also big in genealogy. If you look at the number of people who passed through here, who were born here, who left here, I mean, there's a great story to be told about where your roots are. Yeah. So this is a story about roots, coming back and doing the reconciliation and healing, doing the meditation, and just because when I talk about Point Comfort, it's also the ancestral land of the Native Americans. It's also the land of the first Africans. So there's a lot of meaning in Fort Monroe.
Yeah. Dr. Glass, are you able to rejoin us?
Yes, I am. I just want to thank our panel for an outstanding program. Terry, Calvin, Dee, and Enimini, just a wonderful program. And it reminds me of the importance of buildings and sites as texts, three-dimensional texts that you can read with the help of outstanding guides, the guidance that you provide. And also that history is a resource for understanding our own times. I think you illustrated that in all of your presentations. So it's a very thoughtful, very compelling program. And thank you, Paul, for putting it together. And we're just really delighted. And I hope that the audience will visit all these sites and also visit the National Building Museum when we all reopen and we're back at enjoying each other's company and enjoying each other's knowledge that we can learn from each other. I hope those of you who are in the audience, please support the National Building Museum, support all of these sites. Go to our websites, look at the information, look at the donate button, and try to fill that out as well. And if you're not a member of the National Building Museum, we welcome you to be a member. And I also want to let you know that this program was recorded, and in a few days, maybe about 10 days, it'll be edited and will be posted on our website. So thanks again to all of you in the panel and to our audience, and have a good evening. Thank you.